Hi, I'm Brianne, and this is my Theory of Knowledge final video project. So, in our first unit, which was perception, my linking question was, should we trust eyewitness evidence? And in order to explain this, I examined a quote by Mark Twain, which was, "You can't depend on eyes when your imagination is out of focus." And I think this relates to eyewitness testimony because, let's say you're a victim of, say, a rape. So if you were asked to identify the person who had raped you, you wouldn't really be thinking straight. You would have all these emotions running through you, and you wouldn't be able to clearly understand what happened. So in your head, what you really saw wouldn't actually, in theory, be what you saw, because all of your emotions and everything else, your fears and your trauma by the experience, it could influence what your mind thinks happened. There was an infographic that Ms. Brumall showed us that I thought was really interesting, because it shows that about 50% of wrongful convictions are caused by eyewitness error or faulty memory, which is pretty interesting because that is more than mishandled evidence and snitch testimony combined. In psychology, we talked about the Innocence Project when we did a unit on the cognitive level of analysis and the reliability of memory. We had an assignment to talk about someone who was helped by the Innocence Project and what their experience was like. I picked Terry Chalmers, who had been 18 years old at the time of his conviction. He spent 7.5 years in prison because he had been wrongly convicted of rape and grand larceny. The story was that he shoved a woman into her car and made her perform sexual acts with him, and that he eventually took her car and a bunch of her possessions. Mr. Chalmers, was helped by the Innocence Project because he had petitioned for DNA testing, which eventually proved that he could not possibly be the culprit. And that saved him almost 17 years more of prison. And that's a terrible time to be in prison because he was 18, that is the peak of his life. So the fact that he had to spend the beginning of his adulthood in prison, that's terrible. Following the perception unit, we did a unit on language, and there's actually a pretty interesting picture with on Ms. Verval's blog, and talks about a theory on the intimacy expressed in language, and how the more intimate something is, the fewer words you need in order to describe it. And it starts saying with, in dating, "Will you go out with me" is 6 words, whereas "marry me" is only 2. So if the most intimate thing in this scenario is 2 words, what's more intimate than that? And at the end it says, so what's left? What's the most important and intimate thing to say to somebody? It's goodbye, or maybe even hello. So I thought that was really interesting because when people think about beautiful language, they typically try to describe long novels, Shakespeare, plays that take hundreds and hundreds of pages, describe so many emotions, when the most intimate thing to say to someone is hello or goodbye. Because hello and goodbye contain so many connotations with them. Hello typically signifies a new beginning, whereas goodbye signals an ending of something. My linking question actually for this unit was, how does technology affect language and how does it change language? I actually did a project in relation to technology and language about how texting style, um, how it relates to us. And so I talked about how spelling, use of emoticons or smiley faces, capitalization, all of that affects one person's style and what it says about that person. Um, and I actually related it to criminal forensics, which I'm really into. The murder of Jenny Nickel. Um, she had an ex-lover named David Hodgson who murdered her, and at first many people just thought that she was missing or that she had gone camping with friends or something, but because she had sent text messages from her phone to family members saying she was okay, but her family knew that something was wrong because of the way that she was texting them. She'd spelled things differently, used different punctuation, um, and it wasn't just that it seemed that she wasn't the one texting them, but the style related more to David Hodgson, her ex lover. And through linguistic forensics, they were able to convict him. Also, through this, I talked about how texting style can show, give people more of an idea of the age, gender, and ethnic and geographic backgrounds of the person who you're texting. So say if someone were using a lot of happy faces and not correct, grammatically correct language, a lot of people, according to what I saw in my presentation, believed that the person was a young female. A lot of people weren't able to really conclude about ethnic or geographic backgrounds. The only thing I could really think of is that um, people in the mainland are less likely to use pidgin language, whereas people in Hawaii are more likely to say things like bra and what's up and all those things. Um, and I also talked about emotional portrayal in text messages and how that relates to who we are and what it says about us, like what a lack of emotion would say, and that relates to using, say, smiley faces and the way we punctuate things. Um, it's really amazing how language and the way we use it and word things can affect what people, how we interact with other people. For example, one day I was texting my friend and I was looking back through the conversation a few hours later and I realized that at one point in the conversation I was using typical happy faces, um, overusage of exclamation points and question marks. And then throughout the conversation, there was one point where I just stopped and I just started typing. And I used periods at the end of every sentence and I didn't use any smiley faces. And when I read through the conversation, I actually realized that at that point I'd gotten mad at her. So that shows my emotional portrayal that I was upset. So I kind of shut down in a way. So I wasn't being my typical happy self, and how I portrayed that in my text message. The next unit we studied in TOK was on emotion. I actually thought that was a really interesting picture that we saw in class, and it's shown on the screen. Um, it basically talks about how when you say the same thing over and over, the words begin to lose their meaning. That's because there's not enough language to describe all the emotions in the world. So what I'm trying to say is that the emotions in the world outweigh the language, um, and so the language has less meaning. Um, and my linking question was, are we driven more by emotion or reason? We did a Wix project on emotions, and one of my emotions was loving. And when I was curating things about this emotion, I also looked at quotes and videos. One of my quotes was by Shakespeare. It says, "My heart is ever at your service." Now, this is like when you love someone, you become like a servant because you want to make them happy, so you base all your decisions on that other person. And this affects your reasoning because everything that you used to do for yourself and now you do it for them. In my video I watched The Vampire Diaries, and basically this girl, Elena, she's dating Stefan, who's a vampire, and the fact that he's a vampire puts her through all these troubles, but she's also in love with his brother Damon, and her emotions and all of her feelings for him affect her better judgment, and she makes a lot of bad decisions with him as well. The next unit, our final unit, was Knowledge and Truth, and my linking question for this unit was, how does technology change our knowledge? Now, I remember watching a TED Talk about Wolfram Alpha and how it systemizes our knowledge, and so that it made me start thinking, because Wolfram Alpha, it computes related information about topics that you type in, and it uses knowledge to compute fresh answers to questions. But how much do we really have to know anymore? Because new technology can know things for us. So, how does gaining a wide variety of knowledge and having it at our fingertips actually take knowledge away? Because now we know that we don't have to know things off the top of our head. We can just type it into Google or Wolfram Alpha or ask Siri. So I feel that when we're taking a bunch of knowledge and we put it together and we give it to ourselves, it's more accessible, so the human mind knows that we don't have to know it. So I feel that though technology can help us, it actually hinders our knowledge. And I feel like that's something that we've been talking a lot about in TOK this entire year, because we've been talking about using blogs and a bunch of websites so that we can show people our knowledge. But when we have a huge database, such as Google or Wolfram Alpha, we don't take the knowledge in for ourselves because we know we can look it up later. And that is my TOK final vlog project. Thank you.